Chapter 18. Keep in mind that as we've been walking through Acts, we have, as we get to chapter 18, we have found a point in time where Paul has left Athens and he now is in Corinth. But Timothy and Silas had stayed behind. They're going to join him here pretty quickly as we get into chapter 18. But we do find that Paul is in a different group of people now, different city. And we see a little bit different result than what we've seen in some of the others, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Before we read chapter 18, I want to first kind of lay the groundwork for what the city of Corinth was like. So if you look at your question 1, as we see Luke's record about Paul going into Corinth, do we have any idea what the population of the city would have been in Paul's time? So anybody want to guess or anybody know the approximate size? Again, when we quote numbers like this, realize it's approximate numbers, but it's based on what they've gathered history-wise. So what's a guess on the population? It was big. That's a good guess. It was big. Any idea how big?
100,000.
30,000? 100,000. 6 times that. 650,000 is what they believe it to be. Again, that's a ballpark. That's big. That's really big. Yeah. 650,000. So out of that, they estimate that 400,000 of that were actually servants or slaves. They were in the what Romans would have considered slave system. Now, when we say slave, it's not what we think about when we think about in America slave type plantation stuff. This is people that could have voluntarily become a slave for someone in order to pay a debt off. And so it would have been for a certain number of years, and then they would have been out of that. But they estimate that somewhere around 400,000 of them would have been in that. Now, approximately what year was Paul going into Corinth? Again, this is kind of an estimate on this, but we know that Christ was here on the earth from somewhere around 29 to 32 AD. So what year do you think, estimate-wise, Paul went into Corinth? It was after Christ, by the way. Y'all know that. But
some people are saying as early as 45 now.
Yeah, somewhere around 45. 50 seems to be the kind of the consensus, but they are backing that up a little bit in some studies, but somewhere around 50-ish. That's why I say when we quote these numbers, it's always kind of ballpark number, but it gives you an idea. So this is in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 years after Christ had left the earth, had ascended back into heaven. Now, approximately how many temples were located in Corinth?
I'm going to try 30,000.
Okay, that's way too many. They know of 12. You were close, though, but they know of 12 for sure. There could have been more. These were temples to different gods. 2 of them that we have listed for you is a temple dedicated to Aphrodite. The other was to Apollo. Again, there was at least 10 more, maybe more. But what was the temple dedicated to Aphrodite? What was that one?
Goddess of love.
Goddess of love. Really interesting. That temple employed 1,000 prostitutes. But they were sacred prostitutes. I have no idea what a sacred prostitute is.
That's my question.
Yeah, it's a good question. They were somehow an employee of the temple, and they were responsible for being at the temple, but their role was, again, a prostitute. Now, the temple dedicated to Apollo, Apollo was actually, this temple was dedicated to the worship of the sun primarily, but also music and poetry, among a few other things as well. But they also employed young men. These young men were to fulfill the desires of both men and women who came to the temple to worship. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand this was a very ungodly city. If you were called a Corinthian, it was actually an insult in that day and time. So we look around in our world today and we say, there's terrible things, like the world's in worse shape than it's ever been. Well, if we go back and study some of these cities, because we go back to the Old Testament and we think about Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah was obviously a terrible city, the actions that were going on within it. But you look at a place like Corinth, there's terrible stuff going on there too. So, you've got 1,000 sacred prostitutes. What in the world? So realize that Paul is walking in to a place, and knowing what we've just shared about Corinth, is this a place where you would expect a ministry, Christian ministry, to thrive? Now, the field's wide open, right? There's plenty of work to be done. But how receptive are the people going to be? And you don't know. Paul didn't know, but Paul wasn't worried about what the result was going to be. His responsibility was to go share the gospel. So he wasn't concerned, is there going to be 10 or is there going to be 100,000 or is there going to be 50? That wasn't his mind. His mind was, I'm going to do what God has called me to go do. And it's up to God what happens after that. It's the same mentality that you and I still need to have today. It doesn't matter what society we live in, doesn't matter what community looks like around us. Our responsibility is still to go share the gospel of Jesus Christ. The result of that is up to God. As long as we do our part, it's in God's hands then, because He's the one that draws people. He's the one that convicts the hearts. We just have to be faithful to go talk about Him and share Him, and that's what Paul was willing to do. Plato, I think I skipped that part. Plato actually referenced a Corinthian girl. If you ever read any of Plato's work and you see that Corinthian girl listed, that actually means she was a prostitute. That's just the terminology that was used. So again, realize it's a very, very heathenistic society or city that he was in here. So knowing all that, let's start reading chapter 18, verse 1. It says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people. And he stayed 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. All right, let's pick up with question 2, and let's kind of walk through. So question 2 from verses 2 through 4, what do we see Paul was doing in Corinth, and what was his main purpose for being there? Would it have been easy for him to just settle down and enjoy what we have termed in our society the American dream? So what was Paul doing? Looking at those first few verses.
He was working during the week, and then the holiday was 3 weeks.
Yeah, so he had taken up, by trade, he was a tent maker, so he had taken up that role during the week, but then on the Sabbath, which our Saturday, he would go into the synagogue and he would reason or teach or try and persuade the Jews and Greeks that were there. So do you think that Paul ever had the thought, and I've been kicked out of a lot of cities, I've been beaten, I've been stoned, left for dead. This would be a whole lot easier if I would just kind of settle into this tent making. I can go into the synagogue on the Sabbath and I can teach, and life would probably be easier if I did that. Do you think that thought would have ever crossed Paul's mind?
I don't think he was tonight of doing that, because he had such a burning desire to see the gospel go forth. It not across his mind, but I think that's probably all it is.
Okay, yeah. Tiffany, you started to say?
I said I think that would be human nature. Like that would be easier.
Yeah, I think, human, now again, we know that when God gets hold of us, things change. But that human nature is still there. There's a reason, for some reason, verse 9 exists and was recorded for us. And verse 9 is where God appears to Paul in a vision and tells him, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. Now, was Paul becoming discouraged maybe? We don't know. We don't know the exact reason. As a human, though, would it have been easy for Paul to have said, this whole everyday thing where I'm getting rejected and beaten, would it have been easier for him to say, I'm just kind of going to make tents for a while. I'm going to take a break. It probably would have been easier for him. Take it into today's world. There's a reason that thousands of ministers are walking away from pastoring, and they're going back into secular work. Human nature is it's easier. God never told us that following His will was going to be easy. But we know that in the end, it's what we need to do. But sometimes that I called it American dream. I know that idea didn't exist in Paul's day, but you know what the American dream is today, right? Everyone has a car, a house, and 1.5 kids or 2.5 kids, whatever it was. Could that thought have invaded Paul's mind at certain times to say, let me just make tents for a while? It's possible. We don't know. We know what he did. He continued on. What we find, though, when you get to verse 5, is there seems to be a change between verse 4 and verse 5. In verse 4, we find that he's weekly making tents. Sabbath, he's going into the synagogue and teaching. When you get to verse 5, notice what the terminology is. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was then occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed him, reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. Other scripture gives us the idea and the thought that when Timothy and Silas came, they actually brought an offering to Paul to help support him financially so that he did no longer have to work throughout the week making tents in order to have food, whatever it may have been that he needed. But he was supported similar to what we would do with a missionary today. but he was supported so that he could devote his time to actually sharing the gospel daily, not just on the Sabbath in the synagogues. So if you look at Philippians chapter 4, verse 15, if you want to flip over there. Now, we know that Philippians was written to the church at Philippi. Has Paul been to Philippi yet?
Maybe.
This is going to really hurt my feelings if y'all get this wrong.
No. Yeah, they let you.
Back up a couple of chapters. He was just, he was imprisoned in Philippi. And so, he's been to Philippi. The church has been established in Philippi. So, if you look at Philippians chapter 4, Paul is writing to the church at Philippi. Now, this would be a little bit later. This was not we don't think this was while he was at Corinth that this happened. But chapter 4, verse 15, he says, and you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. It appears that the Philippian church began financially supporting Paul so that he could continue the work and not have to go about tent making in order to survive. Again, this is similar to what we would do today with missionaries that go to whatever country you want to name, and they request support so that they can go and devote themselves to sharing the gospel. That's what we see going on here. Now, to back up to question 3, because I think I missed that one, does the Bible ever mention Aquila and Priscilla separately? Now, this is the couple that comes into Paul's life in verse 2. Does the Bible ever mention them separately? You got a 50-50 shot on this one. No, it does not. It mentions them together, husband and wife. Is that significant or important to us? Or do we learn anything from that?
Yes.
Good answer. What do we learn?
They serve together.
They serve together. Yeah, you know, if you had a marriage that was done in some form of a Christian setting, acknowledging that God is overall, you and your spouse are second unto God in terms of importance, but God is first in your life. If you had that type of marriage vows, then what you would have had in there somewhere is an acknowledgement that you and your spouse can actually work in the ministry together. Now, does that mean that you both pastor a church? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean that you can actually do what Aquila and Priscilla did, and that is to support someone such as Paul financially, provide a place for him to stay, and then also be actively training or discipling people? Absolutely. God designed marriage to be a support system among husband and wife, not just so they exist in the world, but so that they can glorify God through what they do. If you remember, a marriage is actually supposed to be the picture of Christ and what? His church. Yeah. So if a marriage is a picture of Christ and His church, then you find that husband and wife should work together as Christ and the church does to share the gospel and also be supportive, loving, caring, all of those things that we find in that relationship between Christ and the church. So Aquila and Priscilla are really important for us to see that couples can learn today to actually be active in the ministry together. If you have not been active in the ministry together with your spouse, I would encourage you to begin first by doing Bible study at home together, pray together. If you're not doing that, if you're not doing it, start it. Study the Bible together, pray about people that you know need to know Christ. And then in some way? Maybe the answer would be to invite them to your house for supper. And somehow the conversation gets brought up about church or serving the Lord or whatever it may be. Use your home, as Aquila and Priscilla did, use your home to actually be a place that God has given you and blessed you with, but to also be a place of ministry. Any questions or comments about that? Now, this does help if you like your spouse, by the way. I'll just say that. Okay. All right. Question 4 then. We talked about the first part of that. The last part of it, what 2 letters do we know that Paul wrote while he was in Corinth?
First and Second Thessalonians.
Yeah, kind of a giveaway right after that, right? 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Those are the 2 we know he wrote from Corinth. There's a possibility he wrote some others, but we know he wrote them. Now, the reason I bring those things up, and the reason I brought up everything about Corinth and how immoral of a city that it was, is because when you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and you read some of the things that Paul addresses in those 2 letters, then you begin to understand why he's addressing those things. Paul writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians to the church in Corinth. He's establishing the church right now. The letters would be written later, but he's establishing the church here. These issues that we've just talked about, they didn't automatically disappear just because a church was established. Paul even has to write to the church and say, you got some of this stuff going on in the church, you need to get it out of the church. So understand that there were still struggles that went on here, okay? But it makes a little more sense knowing that that's the society he was writing into when you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. All right, question 5. Do we learn anything from Paul's actions in Acts 18, verse 6? What does Paul later say in Acts 20:26, and why could he say this? So looking in Acts 18:6, it says, and when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Do we learn anything from Paul's actions here?
He does what Jesus commanded us to do when we go from place to place and they don't receive us.
Okay. So,
Realize that the Spirit is the one that convicts and not him.
Spirit's the one that convicts, not him. Yeah. He's responsible for sharing, but then it's the Spirit's work or Christ's work to work within the heart. So does this mean that we go to someone and we share the gospel with them once and then we just walk away? That's not what Paul did, right? We need to make sure we see that. Paul didn't just go to them once, share the gospel and say, okay, you didn't accept, so I'm leaving. It's all on you now. Paul had went, we don't know exactly how long. Now, he was in Corinth for 18 months. We don't know exactly the timeline between verse 1 and what we read in verse 6. But the assumption is he has spent quite a bit of time going in and actually talking to them over and over and over again. Does this mean that he gave up on them and he was done with them? Or do you think if one of them would have came to him later on, would he still minister to them? Yeah, absolutely, I think he would have. I don't think he was done. I think what he was doing was saying, I've done what God wanted me to do. I'm going to move to the next group that God wants me to visit with. Because if we're not careful, we can let 1, 2 people take up our entire life. And the only people we share the gospel with is 1 or 2 people. And yet God's got a whole plethora of people out there for us to share the gospel with. But we keep saying, well, I keep talking to these 2 people, and yet nothing ever happens. But it's because God's calling us to go ahead and move on somewhere else. So we can learn maybe from that there is a time where we have to say, we've done what God's called us to do here. Obviously, this would be through the leading of the Spirit in our life. We can't do this on our own. We can't get frustrated with them and say, I'm done. We have to follow the Spirit's leading in that. But there does come a point in time where we realize we have fulfilled our obligation. When Paul shakes the dirt off of his clothing, he's actually saying representatively that he doesn't want any of their unbelief to follow him or to go with him. That's what that represents when he does that. Now, later in Acts chapter 20, if you want to flip a couple of pages over, Acts chapter 20, Paul makes this statement, verse 26. He says, "Therefore I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all. For I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God." How can Paul say that? How can he make that statement? I'm not guilty. I testify to you this day, I'm innocent of the blood of all. How can he say that? He obeyed. He went to the places that God called him to go. Because he did that, he can say he was innocent of all the blood. Now, did that mean that he talked to every person on the face of the earth? No. Does God call you and me to go to every person on the face of the earth? No. He calls us into the areas that he's placed us to be faithful ministers in those areas and wherever he may call us in the future. If we are faithful to share the gospel to those people and to the people that he calls us to in the future, then we can make this same statement. But if we fail to do that, then it's hard for us to make that statement, right? So we have to be attentive to what God's calling us and the people that he's calling us to share it with. Question 6, why do you think that God felt Paul needed to hear what he told him in verses 9 through 11? We talked a little bit about that already. God appears to him in a vision. Do not be afraid, but go on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. What has been Paul's experiences in past cities? Have they left on a handshake? No. Usually left of him having to leave, or else his life was in danger, or he was stoned, or he was beaten, whatever it may have been. Or they told him, you get out of the city, don't stay here anymore. This is one of the first times that we find recorded that God says no one's going to physically lay hands, harm you in any way, physically harm you in any way. So maybe Paul was getting a little bit discouraged. Maybe he was thinking, there's another beating coming. I just don't know when it is, but it's going to happen. We don't know what he's thinking here, but God feels the need to send that message to him. Now, if we already answered how long Paul had stayed in Corinth, that was 18 months. Question 7, if God had told Paul that no one will lay a hand on you, why was Paul brought into court in verses 12 through 13? So look at verse 12. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, now we'll pick that up in a minute, if God said, no one's going to lay a hand on you, why was Paul brought into court?
They basically did not lay a hand on him,
Yeah.
and then they got newspapers on him.
Yeah, so he wasn't physically attacked, which is what God said. You're not going to lay a hand on you. But the ministry he was doing was attacked, which actually, was it his ministry or was it God's ministry? It was God's, right? Now, we feel representative of that, right, even today. But they were attacking the ministry. They were attacking the spread of the gospel. Did Christ forewarn the apostles this would happen? Yeah. And he said, remember, when they attack you, they're not attacking you. They're actually attacking me. They're against me. They're not against you physically here. So we find that they bring Paul into court. Now, question 8. Let's read starting in verse 14. It says, but when Paul was about to open his mouth, it's an interesting statement, by the way. Paul stands in court, and does he have to say anything? Not a word. Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." Now let's back up to verse 13. Here's the accusation, okay? The accusation is, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. What law are they talking about? Roman law. The reason we know it's Roman law, because look over at verse 15. But since it is a matter of questions and words and names about your own law, not Roman law, but your law, that seems to be what Gallio's perspective is. The Jews are trying to say, no, this is against Roman law. Now, why would it be against Roman law if this is what he was doing?
The religion not approved by Rome.
Yeah. Was the Jewish religion approved by Rome? It actually was. Jews could exist, their religion could be in the Roman Empire, and there was not questions asked unless they had an uprising occur. And if an uprising occurred, then Rome was going to shut it down, but that didn't matter who it was, they were going to do that. But the Jewish religion was allowed to exist in Rome. So these Jewish people have the idea, if we go in front of Gallio and we say that he's speaking against the law, Roman law, then Gallio's going to say, okay, this is illegal. Paul's got to quit, and he's in trouble. He's going to be arrested, whatever it may be. But notice Gallio's interpretation. If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, not Roman law, but your own law. Gallio's perspective was, this is just a sect of Judaism. Christianity is not a separate religion. It's similar to like a Pharisee, Sadducee. Now there's just a Christian element within this Judaism. So it's not illegal in Rome. Gallio has no idea what he's done. He may have afterwards later on. But what he has just given Paul permission to do is go throughout the entire Roman Empire and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And no one in Rome is going to say you're going against Roman law, because Gallio has just ruled that it's okay because it's a sect of Judaism. Now we know it wasn't. Paul knew it wasn't a sect of Judaism. But can you see God working here? God has just opened the door for Paul to go wherever he wants to go in the Roman Empire, and no one in Rome is going to say, you can't do this. Now, we know later on, years past this, that Rome becomes very against Christianity after it had blossomed and continued to grow. But at this point in time, Paul has an open road to go wherever he wants. And the Jews are now shut down. It's a matter of them. Now, they can't do anything. They can't put anyone to death without permission of Rome. And Rome says, there's no problem with this. This is a deal that y'all got to work out yourselves, but they can't put anybody to death. So Paul lives another day to go share the gospel again.
I think that's one way Rome kept the peace a lot of times. That's your affair, you take care of it.
Yeah.
They're not interfering with it, unless they have to, like you said.
Yeah, right. Gallio had no idea what he was doing when he said this. And I don't know if maybe Paul recognized it at that moment in time, but Paul would recognize it later on, that now he can go wherever. Now let's look at question 9, verses 16 through 17. A man named Sosthenes is called the ruler of the synagogue. But in verse 8, Crispus is called the ruler of the synagogue. Were there two different leaders, or what probably happened? if you just read it at face value, it almost seems a little bit contradictory, right? Because in verse 8, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, and then you get over to verse 17, and they all see Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue. So what happened here?
I've got a different translation, but it says Sosthenes is the new leader of the synagogue.
Yeah. Yeah, so when Crispus, because if you finish reading verse 8, believed in the Lord together with his entire household, would he have remained the leader of the synagogue? No, he would have been removed, or he would have stepped down himself, one of the two. So he's no longer the leader of the synagogue. He becomes a believer. He's a disciple of Paul, you might say. He's learning about Christianity. So now you have Sosthenes that becomes the ruler of the synagogue, and after they bring Paul in and they say, okay, this is a matter among yourselves. So the Jewish people start beating up the synagogue leader. Now, something very interesting, and we don't know exactly if this is the case or not, but if you'll flip over to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, in verse 1. Notice how Paul begins his letter to Corinth. Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and our brother Sosthenes, who was not a believer at the time he was being beat up. We don't know for sure that this is the same guy. I will say it's interesting, though, the guy, same name and living in the same city, and Paul's calling him a brother now, and he had interaction with him before. There's a really good chance that Sosthenes became a believer as well. Maybe after he got beaten, he decided, these Jews really ain't my friends. I'm going to go with somebody else here for a little while. But anyway, kind of an interesting fact that we see there. Now, going back to Acts chapter 18, question 10, verses 1 through 17, what encouragements do we see that God sent Paul's way so that he would not become discouraged, but would continue to fight the good fight and finish the race? Before we answer that question, I want to ask you this. As we read through verses 1 through 17, as I was reading those, did you ever identify, hey, there's an encouragement that God sent Paul? And then as we read down a few more verses, did you say, hey, there's an encouragement that God sent Paul? As we read down a few more verses, did you say, hey, there's another encouragement that God sent Paul? Like, did you recognize them as we were reading through that? Chances are you might have recognized one or two, especially God's vision to him, but you probably didn't recognize all of them. The reason I bring that up is there are many times that we go through our daily life and God has sent us encouragements throughout life and we don't see them. Because we get busy reading the day of life and we go throughout it and we miss what God has actually done. Aquila and Priscilla, one of the first things we read in the chapter. Do you think that was an encouragement to Paul? It's a place where they've invited me to come in and stay. They're also tent makers. Keep in mind, Paul may have been a little discouraged from previous cities that he's been run out of, and now all of a sudden he goes to Corinth and he runs into some people that are in the same trade as him, and they invite him in. And they work together. Got to be a little bit of an encouragement, right? Now, did Paul recognize it in that moment in time? I don't know if he did or not. Sometimes you and I would not, because we would just think, man, because we've all said it before, man, that's coincidence that worked out. Hopefully you're turning more coincidences into God moments as you go through life and as you recognize them. But there are many times that we go through life and we don't even recognize them. Now, let's continue to look down a little bit further. And we see that Silas and Timothy show up. Now, this is one that you might have said, and I may have actually stopped here when we read through. If they brought, as we think they did, if they brought a financial gift to Paul in order for him to not have to work and make tents and then go speak, but he could just share the gospel, Paul had to be encouraged by that, right? We actually flipped over and we read that he was thankful for what they had done. So we know, looking back on it, Paul was very thankful and encouraged by what they had done. So maybe you saw that one as we went throughout. And then you find that you get down to verse 7. And he left the synagogue and he went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Notice where his house was. Next door to the synagogue. Now, why would Luke throw that in there? Like, was he concerned for us to know where this Justus guy lived? Or was this God working to place Paul in a spot that's next door to the place he's been trying to witness to for so many Sabbaths in a row? And now Paul still has somewhat of an avenue to witness to the people that are walking into the synagogue. In other words, the people that he's been investing in for a long period of time, it's not that he doesn't see them anymore. He just sees them in a different way because he's not standing in the synagogue. You going down from there. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, what happened to him? He became a believer. Have you ever been around or involved, or maybe you were a teacher or you shared the gospel with someone? Anyway, through something that you were involved in, someone became a believer. If you've ever been involved in something like that, is that encouraging to you? Like maybe it was your own child and you see them accept Christ. Do you kind of get this good feeling at that point? Don't you think Paul felt those things as well? Like when people accepted what he had been living his life to do, when they accepted that, don't you think it was kind of a bump for Paul a little bit to feel good that, hey, what I'm doing does matter a little bit? So we find that not only Crispus accepted, but his whole household accepted as well. And then notice, many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. So we find that, and then we go into the vision that God gives him. And he says, don't give up, Paul. Keep on speaking. Don't be silent. No one's going to physically harm you, but I've got many in the city who are my people. Now, what that means is there's a lot more people that need to hear it because a lot more people are going to accept. So don't give up. Then we find this Gallio guy who Paul gets drug in front of, and his life is pretty much in this guy's hands because this guy could have put Paul to death if he would have wanted to. And what happens? Like Paul's prepared to make his defense. Now, I've never been in a courtroom where I was a plaintiff or defendant or whatever, but I've watched TV shows, so I know how it happens, right? It was a joke. Y'all are way too serious tonight, I'm just going to say. Paul gets prepared to defend himself. And who defends him? Is he even a believer in Christ? No. Doesn't this have to be God working in some way? I mean, if you're Paul and you're getting ready to say something and all of a sudden this guy starts speaking and you don't even have to say nothing, do you think he walks out of there feeling pretty good? I would think so. Now, did we catch all of those things as we read through this? You probably caught some of them, maybe half of them. Maybe you're really good, you caught all of them. But there's a chance that just the same as Paul went through this, we go through life on a daily basis and we don't even see where God's been encouraging us along to continue to run the race, to finish well, and to recognize that crown of righteousness that's laid up for us. If we're not careful, we get busy with life. And life distracts us from everything that God's doing in our life. Doesn't matter what situation we're in. Has God walked away from us? Even if you're going through a very difficult time in life, whether it be health, whether it be financial, whether it be physical, whatever it may be, even if you're going through a very difficult time in life, has God walked away? If you're a believer, has God walked away from you? Absolutely not. So why do we feel like He does sometimes? Is it maybe because we're not stopping to recognize how God is working in our life? It could be that we're not attentive enough. It could be that he's doing the same thing that he done here with Paul in these first 17 verses, and we're just not seeing it. Because we're not taking time to realize God's working in our life. We're coming up on Thanksgiving. Y'all know this. It's a time where we typically set aside. Years ago, it was to give thanks for the harvest that we have this time of year. And there's nothing wrong with us giving thanks for that. But many of you work where you get a paycheck every week, so you get a harvest every week. You don't have to wait till November to get that. If we're not careful, we let the things that God does in our life slip past us, and we never give Him thanks for them. Sometimes they look like disappointments. Sometimes it looks like things that we really don't want to happen, or we thought something was going to happen and it doesn't happen, and we think, man, that's terrible. Where's God in this? And yet God was in this. But if we're not careful, we don't give thanks for them, but we actually complain about them. I want to encourage you over the next, week till Thanksgiving? Spend some time daily thinking about how God has worked in your life that day. And then if you want to, kind of backtrack and start going back in your life and think about people that took the time, such as Paul's, that invested in you. Maybe you go back to your teenage years, and maybe you think about someone that took the time to sit by you in church, or took the time to shake your hand after church, or gave you an encouraging word. Or maybe you were just in school and you were having a tough time in school, and someone come up and gave you something that maybe a teacher encouraged you along the way. Maybe they challenged you. I think I've shared this with you guys before. I'll never forget Miss Morrison, my 5th grade teacher, who before we left for Christmas break, nudged herself up onto her desk and pulled out her Bible and read to us the Christmas story. 5th grade. She then challenged us while we were on Christmas break to read the book of Proverbs, because she knew it was going to be valuable for every one of our lives if we would just do it. I don't really remember if I read the book of Proverbs, but I remember that she encouraged me to. I had people like that throughout my life. I didn't realize what God was doing at that moment in time. And you may not have either. But I want you to know that when God urges you to do something through His Spirit, He may be using you to be an encouragement to someone else. And if we're not careful, we let those things go by, and someone else then doesn't have the opportunity to give thanks to God because we failed to be obedient to what we're supposed to do, so that the other person is encouraged. I want you to think for this week about how God has blessed you through individuals that's been in your life, moments that's happened, the Gallios that actually defended you without you having to say a word, and God already had it worked out. Dwell on those things. Give thanks to God daily. Take time. Thank the Lord for what He has done. Identify a person a day between now and Thanksgiving from your past that was faithful to invest in you, that has got you to the point you are today. Brother Eddie.
Gallio had no idea what he was doing, that he was actually being used of God to protect Paul and to actually open up the ministry. You know, his background wasn't that. I mean, his brother was Seneca, the philosopher. Mm-hmm. And he was Stoic philosophy. Stoicism is simply believing be a good person. Yep. Practice the virtues, wisdom, moderation, and there's a couple of others. And that was all you had to do. Yeah. To live a good life.
And that's an interesting point, because remember, Paul has just come from Athens. Now, we don't know if he knows who Gallio's brother was, that you just mentioned, but Stoicism was big in Athens. They worshiped it. If he knew this and this happened, Paul's got to be thinking, God did have this all worked out, and I just didn't see it. God's worked your life out as well. He's promised to never leave you or forsake you. No matter what you're going through, realize God has got it. You may have to endure, but God has it worked out. And ultimately, in the end, there's a crown of righteousness for all those who remained faithful, following Him, believing in His Son, Jesus Christ. Pray with me today, if you would. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we've had together, Lord, for your goodness to us as you have been actively involved in every one of our lives, even today. Lord, if we were to identify everything that you've done for us, the books would not contain. But Lord, I pray that we would be able to at least put our finger on some so that we might give you praise and honor and glory for what you've done in our life. We know that begins with you sending your Son, Jesus Christ, to die for us and to be our perfect sacrifice, to accomplish something that we could not accomplish on our own. So, Lord, it begins with us thanking you for Him. But, Lord, I pray that we don't end there, but that we realize from that point forward, you've continued to be faithful. As a church, you've been faithful to us as well, as a collective body of believers, but Lord, also to our community churches, you've been faithful as well. Lord, when we get to our individual lives and our families' lives, we have so many blessings to give you thanks for. So help us over the next week to reflect upon them, and Lord, as we do, to give you praise for them. I pray this in your Son's name, Jesus the Christ. Amen.